Welcome back, Psychology. So we are starting our unit on motivation and emotion, and we'll space this out over a few videos. And today specifically, we're going to focus on our study of emotion. So as we go through this lecture today, you're going to hear about a number of different theories regarding our emotion and how do we have an emotional response. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So first, let's define the word emotion. We all feel emotions. We can all express some of these emotions that you see here: anger, fear, disgust, all of those. Like, we've experienced those. But let's pinpoint this to psychological terms. So an emotion is a mind and body's integrated response to a stimulus of some kind. So your mind is working with your body, your brain sends messages to parts of your body to do certain things, and that's how we respond to emotions. So because of that, this complex experience, it can be a physiological experience. Okay, there's going to be some type of arousal. You will express your emotions through certain types of behavior. And then you are very much aware. It is a conscious experience. You understand what's going on. So again, it's a mind and body's integrated response to some kind of stimulus. It's physiological. You express behaviors and you're aware of your experience. So as we talk about emotional theories, or the theories of emotion, the question that is tossed around in regards to how we experience emotions is very much like the chicken and the egg debate. Okay, what comes first? So does your bodily arousal, that feeling of arousal, does it come before or after or at the same time? So if you're experiencing anger, do you have some sort of arousal at the same time, or is it a simultaneous experience? Happens together? That's kind of the question that researchers were setting out to find when they developed these theories. Another question is, what is the relationship between cognition and emotion? How do you think about some of these feelings and these emotions? What is the interaction there? And does cognition always come before emotion? Do you understand what you're feeling? You think this is what's happening, and then you feel the appropriate emotion. Or can it happen differently? So that's where we're going as we look at these theories of emotion. So before we get there, we have to kind of understand some terminologies in terms of how we interpret emotion. And the first term is what's called nonverbal communication. So I know my little face in the corner of these videos is barely anything that you can see. So I'll save these for when we meet in class. But our facial expressions, our gestures, how we stand, our posture, our proximity, how close we are to people, some of the ways that we use our voice, our non-linguistic vocal characteristics, all of those things express emotions. And the crazy thing is how in tune our brains are to detecting these subtle expressions. There's some interesting research about emotion and how it is something that can be expressed cross-culturally, that there are so many things that unite us as people, and the expression of human emotion is one of those things. Another aspect, important aspect in studying emotion is what's called a display rule. So in each culture or social group, there are informal norms, okay? These would be practices about what is appropriate when expressing emotions. So in your own social group with your friends, it may be very appropriate when you see each other to greet one another with a hug, or even in some cultures, Emily in Paris, if any of you have watched the show. When Emily arrives in Paris, she's sort of taken aback by the French Parisian custom of giving a double kiss when you greet somebody. It's not part of our culture. So that could be considered to be a display rule. You're happy to see someone when you greet them. It's also important to note that when and where certain things take place and to what degree is a very important aspect of display rules. And I'm sure if you think about your own family, that you have some display rules that maybe if you have a friend that's coming over for the very first time, or if someone's meeting the boyfriend or meeting the girlfriend, that you kind of have to coach them on, these are the things we do, these are the things we don't do in our home. Those would be what we call display rules. So our emotions, what are our emotions? We're pretty tuned in, a lot of us are pretty tuned in to our emotions. But for psychology, and in the world of psychology, they have narrowed it down to 7 specific emotions. And those emotions are fear, anger, sadness, surprise, happiness, disgust, and contempt. And each of those emotions carries with it its own characteristics. Okay, there's a couple of them on there that might not be super familiar, and those might be disgust and contempt. And disgust would be that you don't like something. Contempt is even a degree above that. Contempt is almost a hatred of someone or something. Because they are just so completely and totally disagreeable to you. We'll talk about some of the facial expressions and how we can communicate these nonverbals of these emotions when we get together in class. So we're going to talk about a number of different theories of emotion. And the boxes that you have on your notes are based on the second set of slides that you're going to see with each explanation. So just hold on, don't get super confused here. It'll all make sense in just a minute. So the first theory we need to look at is the James Lange theory. And these are 2 psychologists that worked together, and because they were pretty spectacular, they named the theory after themselves, the James Lange theory. And what they believe, what they found, is that there's some sort of stimulus. Something happens that produces a physiological response. And then, once you've had a physiological response, then you can think about how you responded, and you're able to identify that emotion that you're experiencing. So there is an event, something happens, you see a snake, and then there is a physiological change. Your heartbeat goes up, you begin to sweat, and then the psychological experience, what you call that would be the emotion, and that would probably be fear. So an easy way to remember the James Lange theory is to think about it as the James then Lang theory. So our bodies react first, then we have the emotional feeling. It's the James, then Lang. Our bodies react, then we have the emotional feeling. So let's take a look at this in terms of the James, then Lang theory and how this plays out. So you have the event, and we'll say that you hear some footsteps. And so your physiological response is that you begin to tremble, okay? And your heart's pounding, okay? You're getting nervous. Your heart rate is going up. Then you feel the emotion of fear. So you have the event. The event causes physiological arousal. Then you feel the emotion of fear. So physiological arousal causes the emotion. You have the arousal, then the emotion. So part of this, something that goes right along hand in hand, the research is there to prove, is something called the facial feedback hypothesis. And this will make perfect sense to you. And what it states is that facial movement and expressions can actually influence our attitude and emotional experience. So if you have some sort of physical arousal, okay, and your response is to smile, then suddenly your emotional response won't be as bad, or it might be even better than it would have been had you not smiled. So the act of smiling can actually make you feel happier. And the research, everybody, is there. So it's kind of like fake it till it happens. So, you put on that pretend smile, even though it's a pretend fake smile, what's happening in your brain is actually changing the emotional response that you might have. So the second theory is called the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. And with Cannon-Bard, they believe, again, two individuals think they're pretty great. They named it after themselves. Cannon-Bard suggests that your physical and psychological experience happen at the same time, and that one does not cause the other. So your body's reaction and the emotional feeling happen at the same time. Your body's reaction and the feeling happen at the same time. So because of this, we need to remember the Cannon-Bard theory as the Cannon and Bard theory, because arousal and the emotion happen at the same time. Cannon and Bard. So let's take a look at this again in a different graphic here. So there is an event, you hear those footsteps, and simultaneously at the same time, you experience the arousal, you tremble, your heart rate's going up, and the experience of emotion. So Cannon and Bard, emotion and arousal happen at the same time. So as we talk about emotions and these emotional responses, it's a good idea to consider and review those parts of the brain that are involved in our emotional responses. And so we have to go back to the thalamus, our friends Hal and Amos, because the job of the thalamus is to receive that sensory information, and it can be an emotional stimulus. And that message then is sent into our autonomic nervous system, into our cerebral cortex, and it will send the message that your heart rate needs to go up, your pupils might dilate. It's possible it is possible, and this does happen in the brain with certain types of arousal. If it is a message that needs to be delivered ASAP, it might just flat out skip some of those sensory cortex areas and go directly to the amygdala. The thalamus will transfer and send those messages immediately if it is necessary. And think about it. If you are feeling the emotion of fear, you're going to need to respond quickly. So we've had James, then Lang, Cannon, and Bard. The next one is, there's two names for the same theory, and it's called the Schachter-Singer. Those are the names of the people. Schachter-Singer, two S's, two-factor theory. Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. And this one, there's an extra label here. There's an extra component. And they believe that the physiological arousal occurs first. And then the individual has to identify the reason for this arousal. They have to cognitively determine what is happening, what is going on. And so to really understand the emotion, what kind of emotion we are having, we have to use cues in the environment to consider and cognitively determine what is the current emotion. So let's take a look on another slide here. If you experience a racing heart and sweaty palms, you get nervous, you're a little anxious while you take a math test, you probably have identified it. You know that you are feeling anxious. You've put that cognitive label on that experience. If you experience the same physical response on a date with someone else, you might interpret those same things. A racing heart and sweaty palms, you might call that as love, affection, or even arousal. So you have the same kind of arousal responses and physiological responses, but you have cognitively interpreted those environmental cues. I'm taking a test. This is anxiety. I am on a date. This is love. Okay? They're the same things that are happening to you physiologically, but cognitively, you've interpreted them differently and you put a different label on what that emotion might actually be. So here's another way of looking at it. Your emotions are produced by two separate factors. Okay, you've got a physiological response, and simultaneously your brain is putting a label on that. So you've got this event, you have a physiological response, and your brain is understanding what's happening to your body. And based on those two factors, you then determine what your emotional experience will be. So that cognitive label is really important in the two-factor theory. So an additional theory here is the cognitive appraisal theory. And the name associated with this is a gentleman by the name of Lazarus. And what he believes is that our emotional experience depends on our interpretation for the situation that we are in. So if you take a look at the picture here, the image on the screen, let's say that you're driving, you are the driver on this windy road, okay, high mountain, you're on the edge. So as the driver, you're concerned about the dangerous driving conditions. Your passenger, however, they're not driving. They're just sitting in the passenger seat and they're enjoying the nice views, okay? They're looking at the beauty of the view, but the driver is feeling frightened, but the passenger might be feeling exhilarated. It just depends on how you cognitively appraise the situation, how you interpret the situation that you are in. The opponent processing theory is when you have an emotion and then an opposing emotion will counter that first emotion. So you have kind of this fresh new experience. And then you have something else, another emotion that comes into play. And suddenly, that first emotion doesn't quite feel as intense. And you've all experienced the same thing. You kind of something loses its freshness or its excitement. And people that are adrenaline junkies, they do something a few times and now they're ready for something bigger. That emotion, excitement, that fear, it's no longer there anymore. That's the opponent processing theory. When you experience the first emotion on repeated occasions, then the opposing emotion becomes stronger. That first emotion gets weaker and weaker. So you think about jumping out of a plane. That first experience, whoo, that's exciting. That fear. And then you have less and less fear. Okay, that opposing emotion is taking over, the opponent processing theory. In the last piece to this lecture on emotion, we need to talk about polygraphs. And polygraphs are basically lie detector machines. And what happens in the legal system, a person is hooked up to a machine that will detect changes in your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration level, your breathing rates, and even your skin response. Okay, and then they get sort of a baseline of your arousal level. And they talk to you and they ask you some questions, trying to get a feel for what you think might cause an emotional response. And does anything physiologically happen to you as they ask you these questions? What they're looking for and what they believe and what polygraphs will show is that if you are not telling the truth, that your brain automatically, you will produce some physiological changes. But these polygraphs are not accurately measuring emotion. They do indicate arousal. They'll show changes in heart rate and blood pressure, but they cannot definitively define if somebody is telling the truth or not. But they do show some questions for sure. All right, so there we go. We have finished our lecture on emotion. I'll see you next time.